The Carolina rig and the Texas rig are two very similar rigs, yet they have some distinct characteristics about them that make them better in certain situations, one above the other. And today, that's what we're gonna discuss. Find out why and how to fish the Carolina rig versus the Texas rig. My name is Wesley Littlefield with YourBassGuy.com, and today it's all about the Carolina rig and the Texas rig. Honestly, Texas rig specifically is one of my favorites. I don't throw the Carolina rig a lot because it takes a lot to tie it. There's a lot of stuff that's going on right here. I just prefer just to tie on a hook and go. But with that said, that doesn't mean that the Carolina rig isn't better in some situations, and I'm actually missing fish because I won't fish it. So first, let's get on to talking about the Carolina rig. So what is the Carolina rig? When we're talking about the Carolina rig, I'm just talking about a weight here at the front, usually a swivel. You'll notice that I'm actually using a pre-made rig. I like this because it actually protects the knots better than putting the swivel and tying it all together yourself. So I prefer a pre-made rig, but you can do it all together yourself. Pre-made rig, leader, and then to a weightless soft plastic. It's rigged the same way you would rig a Texas rig as far as the soft plastic goes. It's weedless, which is great. The few things that make it not so great, in my opinion, like I mentioned, is you've got to tie 1-2 knots. So there's 2 more chances of it breaking off. Actually, I guess you've got to tie 3 knots. So there's 3 chances of it breaking off versus just 1. And this extra long leader is not great in brush piles because you can cast it in there and the fish is gonna grab it and wrap it around a limb before you ever have a chance to set the hook and get him out of there. So there's some places that it's just not ideal in. However, the places that it is good for are like deep waters. And when I'm talking deep, I'm talking like 12-foot plus. So if you're fishing 12-foot rock piles off the shore, if you're fishing just 12-foot flat or near ledge, anything like that, the Carolina rig is gonna be your go-to rig. So when you should fish the Carolina rig, honestly, this isn't like a springtime bait. Now, some guys use it in the shallows and you can as a springtime bait, but primarily this is like when it's hot and bass are out in the middle and you need something to get down deep but still have a natural presentation without the weight interfering with the lure's presentation. So usually it's a summertime lure and a deep, as far as more than 12 foot, that's when you're gonna use the Carolina rig. All right, so now the Texas rig. As I told you, I actually like the Texas rig a lot more. I'm biased. Texas rig is the way to go in my opinion because it's simpler to rig and you can fish it deep. It doesn't have the same action, and that's where it does decline, is when you begin to fish it deep with heavier weights, you're not gonna get the same action as you would with a Carolina rig, but you can also fish it in brush piles, around rock. I mean, anywhere you wanna go, the Texas rig can go because it's weedless. Also, why I like the Texas rig better is because it's a more versatile bait throughout the year. So I start throwing the Texas rig early spring and I'll test it out and rig it up all the way through the end of the fall just because the fish bite. I mean, you know, you can work in the early spring, you can put on a small worm like this, and then during the summer you can step up to a big worm and drag a big worm with it. It's just very versatile. You can leave the weight unpinned or you can pin it, and this just helps. You know, if you pin it, it's more like a punch rig, or if you leave it unpinned, then you can, you know, it's free to slide, so you can get a little bit more natural action with it. Either way, it just depends on what situation you're fishing. Now I'm gonna step off into the pond, cast a little bit, and show you a little bit of how I work them. All right, so let's start with the Carolina rig on how to fish it. Both of these are gonna be very similar. You're literally gonna reel it up. Now, casting the Carolina rig is a little bit trickier. If you try to cast it directly overhead like you would, it's not gonna work very well. So when you cast the Carolina rig, you actually wanna make a side cast and throw it out there sidearm. Now we're gonna let it sink all the way to the bottom, and you'll be able to see and know when it sinks and hits the bottom because you'll see your line disappearing, and then it'll rest and kind of have a bow in it, and it won't be a straight line anymore. Now we're just gonna reel it, drag it. You know, if the fish are being real hesitant, you can drag it and reel up the slack. I'll also just straight reel it. And lastly, I'll actually pop it and let it set and come back and reel up the slack and do it again. This popping it action is one of my favorites because it actually gets that weight off the bottom and gets the lure off the bottom and makes it flutter up and then float down, and that will drive the bass just nuts because this lure actually has a more natural falling action like a dying bait fish would. All right, so now on to my favorite, fishing the Texas rig. It's actually gonna be pretty much the same thing because you can cast it out, reel it, slow drag it on the bottom. You can pop it off the bottom and you can cast it out and reel it straight back to you. Now, you're gonna have to play around with which technique works on what days. Some days, the bass, they want it fast and they want it moving. Other days, they want you slow dragging it on the bottom. I mentioned earlier that the Carolina rig is actually a deep water lure or bait, and that's true. And so that also means that if you fish a lot of ponds and if you fish from the bank, I wouldn't even bother with the Carolina rig, to be honest. You're not gonna be able to cast it out far enough for it to make enough of a difference. All right, so back to fishing the Texas rig. We're gonna cast it out. Why I love the Texas rig is because you don't gotta make that sweeping cast like you do because of the leader of the Carolina rig. So we're gonna make our cast anyway, how, whatever, and we're gonna let it sink to the bottom, drag it like we would a Carolina rig. We can pop it like we would a Carolina rig. And of course, we can cast it out and just reel it back in. And these lures act similar and are very similar, with just the main difference being how close the hook and the sinker are together. That's the main difference. So when you're considering which one to use, my go-to honestly is the Texas rig, just because Carolina rig is most effective in deeper water and I don't fish as much deeper water. Now, if you fish a lot of deep water, go with the Carolina rig. Now that you know the differences in these two rigs, I recommend going and checking out my other video that I've got on how to rig a plastic worm 5 other different ways. It'll help you, when the fishing gets tough, it'll be more finesse tactics. It just adds more to your arsenal so you can catch more bass. Never forget that education is important, but fishing is essential.